Hello, and welcome back to the Let Me Add to That podcast. My name is Elizabeth Graswich, Executive Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. We are the largest regional education agency in the United States. We serve 80 school districts and nearly 2 million children. We are excited to use this platform to take a deep dive into the conversations surrounding our students and schools in LA County. In this episode, we're diving into Universal Design for Learning, UDL for short. It's a flexible framework that helps educators create learning experiences that work for all students. Whether you're just starting with UDL or already using it, we've got real examples and practical tips to help you support every learner in your classroom or district. Joining us today are experts in this topic, Anya, Bergman, and Audra, Mesa, both senior program specialists from our Curriculum and Instruction Services Department. Welcome, Anya.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be here.
Thrilled to have you, and welcome, Audra.
Thank you for having us.
So I'm really excited about this topic. I've heard about Universal Design for Learning for a number of years, but I honestly can't define it. So you can help us with just the basics.
Absolutely. So Universal Design for Learning, or what we call UDL, is an approach to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all by setting clear, rigorous goals, anticipating barriers, and proactively designing to minimize those barriers. And the framework was developed by CAST, which is a nonprofit education research and development organization, and they've been working to transform education design for about 40 years. So they've been around for quite a while working on this. But the concept of universal design actually comes out of architecture, and specifically the idea that physical spaces should be designed from the start to be accessible to as many people as possible without the need for retrofitting. So sometimes we know that retrofitting can make a space more accessible, but when we're thinking about universal design, our goal is really that we're being very intentional and proactive from the start to remove barriers to access as we create the design. And from there, we really get into one of our most important foundational concepts of UDL, which is the idea that the barrier is in the design and not in the learner. And this is really a mindset shift for a lot of us when we're thinking about this approach to learning and teaching. And so when we think back to the definition that I gave just a moment ago, our goal as educators is really to anticipate those barriers and then proactively design to minimize them. And we're thinking about situating the problem as the perceived deficit rather than the learner being a problem or creating a challenge. And we're really thinking about this in terms of an asset-oriented approach. And this is as true as it is in learning environments as it is when we're thinking about those physical spaces that we mentioned when we're thinking about architecture. And we know that when we are intentionally designing environments to reduce barriers, every learner can engage in rigorous and meaningful learning. And that's really what we're going for.
So to add onto what Anya was saying, a well-known example of kind of how universal design presents itself in sort of the physical world or the world that we sort of interact with daily is when we think about curb cuts, which sort of first became a thing in like the 1970s when we had activism by disabled individuals, veterans, and students who are really seeking access to public spaces and equal rights. So they were originally designed for wheelchair users, but now they're widely recognized, and maybe even not so much. They're just part of our world. So folks who are carrying or using luggage with wheels or pushing a stroller or doing deliveries with a cart can access the world, use those with those curb cuts, even though it wasn't necessarily designed for them. So we kind of take for granted sometimes some of the things that are embedded in our everyday practices. And so those curb cuts are now kind of designed universally, but at that time they were retrofitted. And so it's kind of interesting to still make those connections to architecture because we see that innovation continuing to happen. If you think about curb cuts being on the street where we have crossing signals. Well, originally those crossing signals had walk and don't walk, but those weren't necessarily accessible for folks who didn't speak the primary language or were visually impaired. So then that evolved into some symbology for crossing the street. And now we see that it's not so rare to come to cross a street and have the audio or the timer kind of give you some guidance on how you can safely move in that space. And so when we look at the origins of universal design for learning in architecture, we see how it creates access. And so really building upon that sort of 40-year legacy, how do we take what's being done originally in architecture and bring that into instructional design?
And that's what it's so interesting, because like immediately like my mind went to a visual of a classroom with like lined up desks, like my horror and like high school where you had to like squeeze into the desk and it was like horrible, right? And like that's just one idea. It's the starting place, right? Of like how those are placed and like how we place, where we place students. But this has gone even beyond to like actually how you construct curriculum and instruction and all those other pieces. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we think about how we bring that into the classroom, one of the things that we often say in the UDL world is what is necessary for some is going to be or has the potential to be good for all. So thinking back to your own experience of kind of shoving yourself into those desks, and even now we think about those tables and how they were designed, what might be necessary for a wheelchair user or somebody who needs some more mobility is actually going to be beneficial for all learners and learners in different contexts. And when we think about how we can maximize our time in that space, now we get into things like flexible seating and movement. And so all of those things come into play, like you're talking about with the environment, the curriculum, the design.
So give me an example of like how this plays out.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that universal design for learning kind of also expands the idea from access into really that design piece, and really thinking more about, sometimes the perspective is how do we design modifications or accommodations for students with disabilities? And UDL is really pushing us into the space of how do we intentionally, proactively design learning for everyone from the start. And so instead of that retrofit, we really are kind of planning for that lesson. And to really think about, like, what does this look like? One of the things that we talk about is that you don't necessarily walk into a classroom and see UDL, but you can sometimes walk into a classroom and feel UDL, which is a little bit tricky because really the origin of it, the beginning of it is engagement and that sense of belonging. And so as educators, we've walked in classrooms and you can sense when the teacher knows the students know the teachers, and they know that they care about each other. And so those really become the foundations of engagement. And you can start to see really how that relationship and that agency has been built into that classroom setting. And it might look different than the classroom next door, but really sort of designing ways to remove barriers for students intentionally. So some of those barriers might be building those relationships with students. Some of those barriers might be providing access to information for students. Like, we live in such an exciting technology-based world. When I think back to when I started in the classroom, things that I would have now accessible to universally designed for my students have grown exponentially just because of the advances in technology.
Right. You know, it's interesting because my understanding is that UDL is also grounded in sciences and neuroscience, which like sometimes now I think like, why didn't we think about neuroscience in the past? But, you know, it's really science-based. And there's actually a framework and guidelines that are around that. So how do you simplify those for like a general audience?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think it's also a very exciting time based on what we know about neuroscience and the learning sciences and how those have really come together to create these frameworks for educators and to make it really practical and applicable in the classroom. So UDL is broadly based on the idea that learning engages three interconnected broad brain networks. So kind of like Audra was talking about with the engagement, that's when we're really thinking about the affective network, and then the recognition and the strategic networks. So as you mentioned, Cass drew on all of that information to build the UDL Guidelines, which is a tool that helps educators intentionally plan for those learner variabilities that Audra was talking about by focusing on those three key principles. And the tool really helps us think specifically about those 3 areas, and then we can really intentionally remove barriers based on what we know about our students and what we know about the context. And something that we often say is that educators are really good at identifying the barriers. Educators can open up a curriculum or a textbook or walk into a classroom and they can say, this will definitely not work for my student. Oh, I've tried that before. That's not going to work. They see it. And that's a really amazing part of being an educator and really being immersed with students day in and day out. And so what the UDL guidelines really do are help us to really think intentionally about, okay, now that we've identified all of these barriers and now that we know what may or may not work for our students, what can we do to remove those barriers? And what are some considerations that we can think about so that we are providing access and universality for all of our learners so that they can have all of these different options for accessing. So we were talking about engagement, really thinking about that why of learning. How do we motivate and sustain learners' interests? We know that we're really thinking really deeply right now about identity and how that factors into our students' variabilities and the different unique challenges that our students face, how students vary from context to context. As I'm sitting here with you right now, it's going to look very different from the way I am behaving or thinking or acting when I get home this evening. So thinking about that in terms of examples, what that looks like in a classroom, we could think about like an algebra class, for example. And if you've been in an algebra class, oftentimes or sometimes we hear students say, why am I learning this? What is this about? Why does this matter to me? When will I use this?
I was so there.
Exactly. And I think all of us sitting here in some iteration and variation, we've been there before. So UDL, especially in terms of engagement, is really helping us think about what can we do to support our students' motivation and engagement in terms of things like setting goals so students understand where they are and where they're going. Providing context. So students are really seeing, how does this learning apply to my everyday life? Maybe I don't plan to become a mathematician per se, but algebra is everywhere in my daily life, and how can I really make those strong connections? And then also really thinking about the learners, we're really getting into emotional capacity. We know that that's a really important part of being engaged. Even thinking back, we have some of those good or not so good memories of being in the classroom. So we're really focusing on growth mindset, assets-based approach, and giving students opportunities to individually and collectively reflect so that they can really think about, like Audra mentioned before, agency. Who am I as a learner? How do I know that I'm understanding the material? What do I need next to be able to progress in my journey, and really being able to take ownership over that?
I think it's also just such an interesting time, to kind of go back to the research and think, like you started saying, why have we always sort of considered neuroscience and that being the foundation, and really kind of seeing how we've moved, with the support of CAS over the past 40 years from taking that research and really applying it into classroom settings. And so we kind of look to researchers like Dr. Judy Willis, who was a neurologist, and then moved into getting her teaching credential because she really wanted to see, what does this look like in action? How do I support classrooms really with that science, that brain work? And really a lot that came out of her work is how much we can tie emotion to learning. And then from her work, we see kind of the moves into Dr. Zaretta Hammond, looking also at neuroscience, at culturally responsive teaching. And so the field is moving forward. And so it's an incredibly exciting time to kind of look at the past and the present and really see the opportunities that exist to start investing and implementing UDL. And so we're incredibly honored here at LACOE that we've had the opportunity to really dive into supporting districts, supporting coaches, supporting classroom teachers, really giving the opportunity to put some of this work into action, really having conversations around what are the barriers that you're facing, how do we turn to the supports of neuroscience, of research, of the CAS guidelines, and how do we start to remove some of those barriers that are presenting those challenges in how your classroom, your instruction, your lessons have been designed.
It's so interesting because I have had several conversations with different professors and people at the university level who always kind of say, is the research actually being used, right? In K-12? And like you just named two big names, right? And we're using it. I'm really proud of the fact that LACOE is using it, that we can say that. So thank you. And then the other piece is just the engagement piece, right? Yeah. We have heard on our podcast over and over again from multiple people at LACOE, different subject areas, how important engagement is. And so here's like another entry point, another way of thinking about it.
And I think it's important because really when we look at those UDL guidelines, they're really giving us some concrete considerations to think about implementing when we want to address the area of engagement. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of time we talk about engagement, but the question is, what does that look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And for as a classroom educator on a Tuesday afternoon after lunch, how do I get my students to engage? And so really kind of getting the opportunity to dive into those considerations with teachers, whether it's in PLC times, conversations with coaches, to really start to unpack what some of those considerations are and what they might look in the classroom. It's just an incredibly exciting opportunity to put the research into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a piece of this is proactive planning, right? And so what does that look like for an educator as they're thinking about designing lessons? We know how much they have on their plates, but this is really important.
I think the interesting thing about the idea of proactive planning is that it really calls into the fact that what we've kind of been talking about, that the barriers can be anticipated. Anya and I often joke, and like she mentioned, that teachers are really good at identifying those barriers. They can open up a curriculum, they can see that lesson plan, and they think of those students in their classroom and go, this is where the challenges are going to be. And so really the idea of proactive planning is using that expertise, that knowledge, those relationships that teachers have built, and really kind of leveraging that to see how do we start to remove some of those barriers and challenges that teachers are so great at identifying. But then the question comes, but how do I do it? I know they're going to struggle with the vocabulary, the language in this particular lesson. How do I start to remove those pieces? And that's really where that proactive planning comes into place. I think sometimes we think about the proactive planning of UDL and the responsiveness of differentiation. And we really want to make it clear that it's not that those two things are in competition with each other, but they should really be working in conjunction with one another. Because if I am differentiating, I'm responding to students in the instruction after the instruction. And UDL really gives us the space and the opportunity to think about how do we design things before we're in the middle of that lesson.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think kind of the practical piece to it as we think about what does that really look like, UDL or the framework really does give us some things to think about. And one of the major pieces of the design process is thinking about setting really clear goals, but then having what they call flexible means or flexible ways of getting there. And I think that's really important. I think this is something that teachers are good at setting goals. And now we expand that a little bit when we're thinking about universal design into, if this is our goal, if we have these standards and we've created these goals around them, what are all of the different ways that students can show us their understanding of that goal? And when we think about it, it really can be a lot more expansive than sometimes a traditional curriculum or a traditional lesson plan might be. So one of the principles that we talked about relating to those brain networks was engagement. And another one is action and expression, which is really thinking about how are students demonstrating what they've learned or what they understand. So when we pair that with the idea of the goal, we're really thinking about, okay, if I am asking my students to understand, for example, the impact of historical figures in different civil rights movements, what are different ways that students could demonstrate understanding of this sort of broad goal? So there are so many things that could factor into that. Of course, thinking about the variability of our students, what barriers we might want to be removing, but we're thinking about, are we giving students some choice in terms of which historical figures are they looking at? Which civil rights movements are they looking at? What are they connecting with? Are they do they want to create a podcast to demonstrate what they've learned? Do they have to be writing? Or does writing have to look like an essay? Could it be a poem or a song? Just so many different ways. And I think what's really amazing about the way that we're talking about universal design for learning right now is that our ultimate goal is learner agency. So we're really thinking about, okay, that might sound like a lot. Okay, now we have a podcast and a song and a dance and a poem and all of these things. But it's really allowing students to take ownership of their learning. And when we have that firm goal in place, the goal is always the same. That's never going to change. So if we were to create a rubric, for example, and set success criteria, that will still look the same. We're still asking students to explain the impact of a historical figure. We're still asking them to provide details or whatever it is. And it's their responsibility now to see if they can accomplish all of that in the modality of their choice. So I think that is very exciting. And we sometimes talk about it as giving permission to both the learners and the educators. The goal is sort of give permission and guidance. The goal is the guidance, and then the permission to really explore how we're going to make that goal our own and understand the material in the way that's best for us.
I just love this. Like I don't normally do this on my podcast, but I just keep going back to like, where were you when I was a kid? Like I could have used this.
I think that's for all of us. I think, we talk sometimes like if I go back to the classroom, how radically different that classroom will look knowing what I know now.
Right.
And I think, it's one of the challenges of this profession is that sometimes when we step out of the traditional classroom educator role, we get all of this professional learning and these opportunities to expand our understanding. And so I think that's really why we're committed to working with coaches, working with educators to really demonstrate what this looks like, because we missed this opportunity when we were in the classroom to provide, an inclusive space for students in the way that it gets reflected now. And I think one of the ways that we really try to do that is to talk about it, what it looks like in a classroom setting, but we also we talk about the intentionality, the purposeful intentionality of even how we design professional learning for educators. The question is always, what does UDL look like, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't want to give this prescribed checklist because with variability, it's going to look different for everyone in the room. And so oftentimes when we're designing professional learning, we're designing for adult learners. And so Anya and I very deliberately start to think about what are the barriers that are going to exist in this professional learning space, whether we're together physically, whether it's virtual, how do we start to address some of those barriers? And it's been interesting for us to really kind of lean on and dive into the expanded UDL guidelines and use some of those considerations to really design intentional professional learning. And it's interesting because sometimes we get feedback and people are like, you know what? This day just felt so different. I really like it, just the flow and the way that we got to work through things. I just really appreciated the day. And then the question might be, but like, I'd really like for us to get into what UDL looks like. And you're like, you just got it. You just lived it. You experienced. You didn't even know it was happening, but you felt it. And I think sometimes the thing that they latch onto the most is that it felt different. Right. And so how do we provide that different learning experience, not only for adult learners, but how do we transfer that so they can actually start to provide some of those experience for the students they serve?
Well, and it goes to like, how do you communicate that it's not just another thing on their plate? I mean, we were kind of talking about acronyms and, I know educators, like over the years, especially if you've been in the profession for a while, you've seen new things roll out or come out or new professional development, and you're going, oh, it's just another thing. But how do you get over that barrier that sometimes exists when this, really does seem to be like what they're doing, but like an expanded version of it?
And I think that's 100% a valid concern, right? Mm-hmm. Teachers are asked to do more, right? They are stretched pretty thin. And so one of the things that we really want to focus on is that UDL is not doing more, but UDL is doing things differently. Mm-hmm. And I think in some of those coaching conversations that we've had, that's really been a powerful sort of turning point, because we really do think about how can we do things differently. One of the things we hear sometimes, like, isn't this just good teaching? Am I already doing this? And sometimes the answer is yes. Like, we are able to see educators doing incredible things. I think when we say we want things done differently, or we want to look at things differently, it's really about the intentionality to remove barriers. And so if we're thinking about some of the barriers that we can remove for some of our students, we also get to this idea of designing for the margins, right? And so I may have the intention to remove a barrier for a particular group of students. The challenge can sometimes be that I'm creating a barrier for someone else, right? Like with the previous example of curb cuts, like we're going to put up signals so people can read when they stop and when they go. But if I'm visually impaired, that just created another barrier for me. And so I really think as much as we can focus the conversation around removing barriers, teachers see, a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is really there. I'm already trying to remove those barriers. Well, can we do it in a way where we're designing for the margins of our students and actually reach more of those students with that intentional design? So doing it differently in some ways might save us some time, but time is still definitely a legitimate concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think sometimes it's helpful when we're talking in broad strokes about UDL. It's a lot to think about and it's a lot to take in. We talked about how it's mindset shifts. But then when we think about, specific students in our classroom, like Audra was talking about, designing for the margins, and sometimes we know that there's something else maybe that we could be trying for that student, or something is going on. And when we think about it in terms of, and kind of reframe it in terms of the barriers being in the design and not the learner, we say that it kind of gives us a lot more freedom to think about, okay, the door is not closed anymore. We're opening these doors so we can really think about, what is it? Maybe we can use the UDL guidelines as our tool and pull some of those considerations and think about, what if I tried this for this student? How could that have a greater impact on the whole class? What if we attempted this? And we also say that it's not a quick fix. It's going to take some time. It's going to take time to really get into that mindset. It's also going to take time to think about, how are we planning for the variability of our students proactively? How are we trying things and thinking about removing barriers, attempting and then seeing what works, or whether we were able to remove some of those barriers, or what else we need to do. So all of that takes time. So I think thinking about our students, and then kind of like you've mentioned, thinking about ourselves individually. I think sometimes we think back and we're like, well, we were able to push through in algebra, or we were, I got through it some way, somehow. But when we think about ourselves as adult learners, there are a lot of things that we're now, like technology, that we utilize all the time. We are very grateful we were looking at how you developed this podcast, sort of as this like meta example right here and now of all of the amazing universally designed aspects of this podcast that all of us benefit from. When I listen to podcasts, sometimes I slow them down or I speed them up depending on the context. Am I driving to work? Am I thinking about different things and I need to go back and listen again? We often talk about closed captioning as something, back to the idea of necessary for some but good for all. How many of us now use closed captioning as we're watching TV or movies? And so when we thought about this podcast and went to look at all of the pieces that are there, we were really, really impressed. Just thinking about how you can access it through different podcast platforms. You can watch on, or have access to it on YouTube. All the functionality that YouTube has, including the playback speeds, the transcripts, translating into other languages. What were some of the other ones?
I think, and just even how much closed captioning in your primary language supports reading comprehension, right? Or supports fluency. All of these skills that we aren't necessarily trying to develop as adults, but you can see their place in instruction and in classrooms. And so when you're designing this podcast and the accessibility to those resources, you're probably reaching folks that you may not have designed that resource for, but somebody's like, oh, I can really benefit from engaging in it this way. And now I can actually go back and share that podcast. I can provide a verbal synopsis. I could write down some notes to share with a colleague. So you sort of live those UDL guidelines. People are coming to this podcast because they want to engage in this topic. It's being represented in all of these different ways. And because of that, it's now actionable in all of these different ways for educators to take this learning and apply it in a context that works for them. They have agency to do that.
Just have my mind racing about like all the ways I could like try to apply UDL just in our communications world, things that we hadn't thought about. I'm glad to hear we're doing a good job. But, I mean, it's just so fascinating.
We talk about UDL as being a lens, and once you sort of see the world through the UDL lens, it's really hard to take off those glasses and see it differently. So we worked with colleagues here at LACOE, and we've, collaborated on UDL efforts and professional learning. And then a few weeks later, someone would be like, I was at my kid's Little League game, and I was noticing that the coach really missed an opportunity to provide some, variability in how the kids were running their drills. And we're like, yeah, once you see it, it's really difficult to shut it off. But, our point is also you don't want to shut it off. You want to operate and think about, as I'm moving in this space, how can I design things to be just a little bit better, a little bit more accessible, a little bit more intentional for the folks who are going to interact, in this space in this way.
Do you have favorite examples of a UDL implementation impact that you'd like to share? I'm loving your examples.
Yeah.
It's funny because we have been really fortunate to be able to implement UDL in so many ways that kind of allow for a different level of depth. So we've had the opportunity to provide a series called UDL in Action and really sort of reach out to coaches, to administrators, to specialists to really come together and talk about UDL and what that looks like in, like I was saying, that professional learning space. And it's been incredible because some of the coaches that we've supported, we've been able to go back to their school sites and partner with them in bringing UDL and universal design approaches, this whole framework, to their staff meetings, to their PLCs. And it's been such an incredible learning experience for us because as much as we try to design for that variability, we come into that professional learning setting, and again, in that moment, you're like, oh, this isn't going to work, right? The layouts, the table, the time of day, the context that Anya was talking about. We joke and we laugh and we reflect when we think that we were presenting to a wonderful staff the Friday before the Thanksgiving break. And so when you think about engagement, like how engaged are you at when I'm sort of the barrier to your holiday, right? So how do we kind of design things and switch that approach? And so through that like really collaborative work, I think back to kind of what our first day there was like in presenting in a traditional staff meeting sort of setting, and how it evolved to one of the final staff meetings after we'd been there for PLCs. Their site administrator really asked, like, what do you guys want these staff meetings to be? And the next time we were there were these little workshops. Anya led one, I led one, the coach and a teacher on site led one, and people had autonomy and choice to go and seek out the learning that they wanted. Mm-hmm. And so you just think about, like, that's such a great example of what it looked like. But it's not just, hey, every administrator, switch up those staff meetings. It really came from this collaborative work and a lot of what we talk about in the mindset of how do we universally design things.
Yeah. It's impressive. I'm just so excited about it. I talk about AI all the time, but I think I'm going to be talking about UDL all the time moving forward. So
I was going to jump in.
UDL and AI.
I was like,
marry those two.
About to, yeah. We are really excited about AI too, and we think AI and generative AI tools have an incredible potential when we're thinking about UDL, because we talked about how UDL is about this proactive planning and it's about variability, and that it's not one more thing. At the same time, it is a different way of thinking about things. And so we have been exploring some generative AI tools from ChatGPT, of course. And then there's even a tool that was developed specifically for UDL called Ludia, Ludia. And it's programmed to understand this idea that the barrier is in the design and not the learner. So what teachers or educators can do is, of course, in whatever way that they want. And the amazing part is that they'll always think of new ways to do this. But for example, you could put in your lesson plan and the AI is trained to be looking for some of those barriers. Or you can say, hey, I have this group of students. I have multilingual learners, or I have students who really benefit from having a lot of mobility, being able to move around or being able to talk to each other. And the AI will look at your lesson and say, okay, here are some, and we think about these in terms of design areas. So maybe it's in terms of your materials. Here are some barriers that we're seeing. The methods, here are some barriers, and here are some ways that you could provide different methods. Even the assessment. What are different ways that we could look at the assessments? And then overall the environment. How can we remove some of the barriers in terms of the environment? So back to Audra's example about the teachers that we were working with, it's been very, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, very cool to see teachers kind of take on these tools and put in their lessons and just use the generative AI as thought partners, and really allow them to be thinking in terms of UDL. And just sometimes it's hard to think of another idea or what might work or how could this work for students. And then when they see what AI can come up with, of course, you've experienced this before, it's like, whoa, just incredible. So that's been really, really fun too.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because I was hesitant to, because I always ask. So
we can't avoid it, right?
No.
It's one of those things that really provides an opportunity. And I feel like sometimes folks are like, well, we have to wait until we understand it. But really, in our work that we've been able to do, it's about kind of maybe removing the barrier of fear sometimes, or the unknown for teachers, and thinking about, like, how do we use this in a way that still gives you your agency? You're still the instructional designer of that lesson. Like, teachers are not going to be replaced, that expertise that you bring to instruction, but because of how this generative AI is programmed, it's going to serve, like Anya said, as that thought partner to give you some of those considerations in UDL. I think sometimes, and I'll speak for myself, was as a classroom educator, type A, tend to be a perfectionist. I think sometimes teachers are like, I want to do it right. And so until I can do it right, like, let's not get started. I want to make sure that I can do this well. And one of the things we talk about with UDL is just start small. Just think about one consideration that you can make to intentionally remove one barrier for one student on that day, and you're already sort of on your way into that work. We don't have to implement the entire framework every single day for every single lesson. Let's just start small with some of that intentionality.
What a rewarding approach, like small wins,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So, you know, it sounds like UDL can evolve, right?
Yes.
Like it's just not one thing. We're talking about AI. I mean, we have very much a changing world that we're living in. And so it's something that can evolve with kind of the changes in the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the UDL guidelines that we're talking about now is the UDL Guidelines 3.0. And we used to say it's hot off the presses, but now it's been about a year.
It's about to be a year old.
Yeah, it's about to be a year old. So it was released or expanded, they say, in July 2024. So it's really an exciting time to be entering the work, because all of us are in the process of understanding how the guidelines have changed and shifted. And the new iteration is really, like you're mentioning, responding to this strong call from the field to address some of these critical barriers that we know exist in terms of bias and systems of exclusion for learners with and without disabilities. And there are some really powerful shifts that we've seen as we've gotten further into the new guidelines.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, even just that language of it being expanded, right? So it's not that we changed anything or that CAST changed anything, but like we know better, and so we're expanding our way of thinking around that. And so some of the things that have kind of come out in this expanded version is a stronger emphasis on identity, on bias, and what we now call or refer to as learner agency. So in a previous iteration, we would talk about the ultimate goal of UDL being expert learning. And then as you sort of sit and reflect on that, it's like, well, who's defining expertise? Whose values are coming to shape that understanding of expertise? And so in that expansion, we sort of turn to this idea of learner agency. I don't want to define you as an expert learner. I want to provide design agency for you in these lessons so that you're really empowered to sort of do that work. So that's kind of one of been the bigger pieces. The supporting agency really means that we have to recognize identity as part of the learner variability. So as Anya was saying, researchers and practitioners really sort of said that, this is a piece that isn't defined or it might be missing. And so we really need to investigate and expand that, because we have to acknowledge everyone's lived experience, not just as students, but also us as adult learners. And we really have to start investing some time in exploring the challenges that come along with that. And whether we're looking at the principles of engagement, representation, action, and expression, we see addressing bias and identity work in all of those components of the UDL guidelines, which is incredibly exciting because it's kind of expanding into more of this holistic view of the learner. And when we think about it, it's sort of expanding into areas where we've already been doing this work. When we talk about a multi-tiered system of support, we talk about the whole child. And so with the expanded UDL guidelines, where there are considerations for culturally responsive teaching practices, for social emotional learning, and we're really starting to see how do we support educators in designing to address the full, complete complexity of the students they have, and not just kind of in these instructional, emotional, behavioral approaches, but really kind of this encompassing piece. And so it's really exciting to be, celebrating the 1 year anniversary birthday of that expansion. But I think it's also really empowering for teachers to see how these guidelines have expanded. One of the ones I think that people often are drawn to, either with excitement or kind of curious confusion, is the idea that we're now looking at nurturing joy in play. And so I think in like a TK pre-K setting, it's like, yes, this is what we've been talking about. But in a secondary high school setting, it's like, what does that look like to nurture joy and play with 10th graders in my 5th period class, right? And so really thinking about how do we expand those ideas of engagement, the ideas of joy, and really looking at, some examples of what texts are students reading in their 10th grade class. Do they see themselves reflected in that text? When we think about bias and identity, whose story is being told? Are there ways that we can pair the text that they're reading with more modern, contemporary art examples, whether that's actual art, poetry, music? How do we start to tap into maybe the themes that we're learning in our 10th grade English class into maybe more contemporary music that students are listening to, and really start to make some of those ties together? So it can be done, right? And it's just kind of this exciting time to really think about how do we nurture joy for our students as a means to get them engaged in their learning.
That's such a wonderful phrase, nurturing joy and play.
Right.
And for everyone, right? We all need that.
It is, I think, one of the things that people kind of tap into when they come to some of our professional learning. We have, coloring pages to doodle. We have fidgets. We build collaborative community playlists that we play during our break. There's an art station. We have a gratitude station to thank people who supported you during the day. Just these small little intentional pieces that people are like, gosh, it felt different today. It felt good. I was relaxed. some barriers were removed for me. And so I think, again, as much as we can push that into the instruction that's happening in classroom, we're excited for teachers to get that same sort of reaction from students.
It's, again, just so exciting. But, as we kind of close and wrap up, we want to leave our listeners with how do they access this, right? We have a lot of district leaders, school leaders, educators who listen to our show. How can they access and apply UDL in their classrooms?
It's incredible that through this work that Anya and I have been able to do, that we just get to access and collaborate with so many experts. And at a professional learning that we were attending, they were playing a video where they asked the late disability rights advocate Judy Heumann a very simple question, like, what does a fully inclusive school or learning environment look like? And her response was, a fully inclusive school is one where the leadership from the top down believes that inclusion works. Mm-hmm. And I think what struck us about her response is that it's so powerful in its simplicity because it starts with a belief. And so much of this work around universal design for learning and inclusion begins with a mindset. And so when we think about what do we start to do, it's not necessarily implementing frameworks, changing curriculum, but really starting to think about how do we shift those mindsets from how do we retrofit and accommodate and make modifications to what if our mindset is how do we design to remove barriers and address a variability from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think it can seem like a big lift. And of course, we're here to support. And I think, like Audra mentioned earlier, sometimes it's those small starts. And when we think about mindset shifts, we're really thinking about how our language can shift that mindset slowly but surely. And so really thinking about, or even leaving this podcast today or listening to this podcast and leaving with this idea that the barrier is in the design and not the learner. Mm-hmm. And really just letting that sink in, really thinking about how that could be applied in your school, LEA environment. How can that be applied in your home environment? What does that look like for you? What does that mean for you? And then, as Audra mentioned, also sometimes educators feel like they need to get the full picture of UDL before they feel like they can start to talk about it at all. When really, like she said, we're really just talking about removing barriers. So starting that process slowly by having conversations with other colleagues, by thinking about maybe not a total overhaul of your staff meeting, but what are some of the barriers that we really do know exist in the form of this staff meeting or whatever meeting we're having, and how can we make one change to attempt to remove that barrier? I think those are the mindset ways to start to begin this long process of the UDL journey.
Well, I just want to offer a huge thank you to our guests, Anya and Audra, for being here and for the work you do every day to make education more accessible, equitable, and meaningful.
Thank you so much. We're just so excited about the work that's happening all around LA County, around inclusive practices. We're really, really happy to be part of that and to be supporting educators all across the county. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, I think it ultimately comes down to that agency. And really, we found that's accessible through partnerships. So partnering just even to collaborate on this podcast, partnering with educators across LA County. We're deeply honored to be involved in this work and representing LACOE.
Well, I can certainly commit to our team being in touch for more partnerships. We hope that our audience is walking away with a clearer picture of what UDL is, why it matters, and how you can bring it to life in your own context, whether that's in the classroom, in leadership, or in a way you support teachers and students. Thank you.
Please follow the Los Angeles County Office of Education on Instagram and YouTube at Los Angeles COE. That's Los Angeles COE. Or you can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn at Los Angeles County Office of Education.